The key point I want to really make at the start of the session is that we are not going to be showing you our firm proposals. We really want to hear from you and refine our proposals going forward based on what you tell us. We really do see your participation in how we design and take forward the scheme is key to its success. We very definitely want to enter into this as a partnership and work together with farmers, landowners and experts to make the difference. So we're here today to set out an initial view of what we want to achieve through our pilot projects and the approach which we think will help us deliver this in the most effective way possible. And then, as Catherine has said, gather your feedback throughout. So please do use Slido to pop up your questions, to pop up your observations, and then look out for the feedback form, which we're going to be sending you after the event. This will be I suppose, a longer opportunity for you to share your thoughts, questions and ideas, which we really want to then take away and play back. This is the first of 3 sessions, and we're intending to run them in essentially an identical way. So if for any reason you need to drop out of today, you can always come back, but also please don't feel you're missing out by not coming to any of the other scheme sessions. Shaz, can I have the next slide, please? So today's agenda, our aim is to cover the key elements of how we think the landscape recovery pilot will work. We want to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So Catherine, as Catherine has suggested. So what we won't do is stop for questions in the meantime, but we'll keep them for the panel towards the end of the session. So you'll notice that we've also deliberately kept the details on the slides to a minimum, particularly in consideration of people looking at this on smaller screens. I expect there's a lot of you in that boat. So just to be really clear, we're not able to provide full details on every aspect of the scheme at this stage. This isn't where we are in the process yet. We're still looking at some elements, for example, how details on how payments could work, what the application form should look at. We'll be bringing these proposals to you at a later stage, but we want now to talk to make sure we're on the right track so that we hear your ideas and factor them into our thinking early on. When the time comes to open applications, we'll provide comprehensive and detailed information and guidance so that you'll have all the information you need to decide whether to apply and to fill in the application paperwork. So although we'll be covering how landscape recovery interacts with other environmental schemes, we're not going to be providing detailed information in this presentation about sustainable farming incentive or the local nature recovery. If you want more information on those schemes, please do visit gov.uk or our Future Farming blog where it's all set out. You can also, of course, contact the team and we can put you in touch with the right people. So without much further ado, I'd like you to pass you on to Sophia, the team leader, who will take you through our early thinking on landscape recovery.
Fab. Thank you so much, Jolie. So I'm going to cover the first part of the presentation on what the scheme is and the themes we're choosing, and I'm going to hand over to Sam, who will be picking up the next part. So I'm sure many of you are aware that landscape recovery is one of our 3 new environmental land management schemes, along with local nature recovery and the sustainable farming incentive. The really distinctive thing about landscape recovery is we think it will be a mechanism to put in place bespoke agreements, potentially with bespoke payment rates, and that we would use this to deliver long-term, large-scale projects, for example, to deliver landscape and ecosystem recovery. There's a wide variety of environmental outcomes and targets which we think these projects could contribute towards if they're looking at large projects, including the 25-year environment plan, our net zero goals, the 30 by 30 pledge, and the other things listed on this slide. The kinds of things that we could be delivering at scale could be creating nature reserves, restoring rivers, restoring wetlands or peatlands, creating woodland and more. And we will give you some more specific examples later on in this presentation to make sure you've got a kind of clear idea of what kinds of things we're envisaging we could be supporting through this scheme. If we can go to the next slide, please. So on this slide, we've just quickly shown how the 3 schemes fit together. And as Jolie said, we're not going to be talking in great depth about sustainable farming incentive and local nature recovery, but there's lots more information on gov.uk if you're interested in that, and you feel free to ask us any questions about how the schemes fit together if you have any. But just to give you an overview, the sustainable farming incentive will pay farmers for simple actions that encourage good environmental practice, and it aims to accelerate the widespread large-scale adoption of sustainable farming approaches, building on all the excellent practice already happening in many places. The local nature recovery scheme then will build on that and represents the next level of ambition from the sustainable farming incentive. And it will focus on locally targeted environmental action, looking at aligning with things like the local nature recovery strategies and encouraging collaboration between people involved in that scheme. So both those schemes we expect will involve a menu of standards or options for farmers and land managers to choose from. And that's different from landscape recovery, where we aim to put in place bespoke agreements. And we hope to use that to facilitate the kind of large scale and long term projects that might be difficult to deliver under the first of those two schemes. For example, we could be looking at large scale land use change projects. So if you want more information on the sustainable farming incentive or on local nature recovery, please do have a look at the agriculture transition plan update that we published in June, and the future farming blog, as we've already mentioned. There'll be more information provided about those schemes in the coming months. But for the rest of the presentation, we're going to focus on landscape recovery. If I can just go to the next slide. This slide shows the overall timelines for rolling out the three schemes, and I won't talk in detail about the other schemes. The key thing for landscape recovery, as you can see from the slide, is that we are starting piloting in the coming years by setting up our first projects, and then we hope to scale the scheme up more widely from 2024. So our aim is to learn from these initial pilots to help us get the scheme design right for when we scale this up from that point. Next slide, please, Shaz. Thank you. So I'm sure a lot of you are here because you're aware that we have committed to initiating at least 10 pilot projects in landscape recovery between 2022 and 24. And we want those projects to deliver over 20,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat. We plan to launch these pilot projects in at least a couple of waves. So today we're focusing on the first wave of pilot projects, which we hope to open for applications later this year. And we want the first wave to focus on the two themes shown on this slide. So the first is recovering and restoring England's threatened native species, with a focus on birds and insects. We've highlighted birds and insects because they're a good proxy for overall nature recovery and habitat quality and species abundance. And we envisage the projects under this theme would recover priority habitats. The second theme is restoring England's streams and rivers. And these projects could be restoring water bodies, rivers and floodplains to a more natural state. They could be reducing nutrient pollution, benefiting aquatic species, improving flood mitigation and resilience to climate change. All projects under either theme would be expected to deliver other environmental benefits. For example, a project looking at streams and rivers would almost certainly have benefits for biodiversity as well, and we'll particularly be interested in the benefits for carbon emissions and sequestration. Sam will talk a bit more about how the criteria for selecting the projects will work shortly. The reason we've chosen these themes is we see them as areas where cooperation between partners at landscape scale could make a really significant impact. But these aren't the only themes where that could be the case, and it's likely that we will introduce other themes for later waves of landscape recovery pilots and for projects in future. And net zero is very likely to be a focus in future waves, but we'll confirm in due course what those future themes will be. So for this wave, it's those two themes, and then we'll confirm later what opportunities there are to bid for other kinds of projects. So I'm now going to hand over to Sam, who is going to talk you a bit more about the selection process for these projects.
Thanks, Sophia. Could we go to the next slide, please, Shaz? So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how we envisage the selection process working for landscape recovery for the pilots. If you could move to the next slide again, please, Shaz. So we're currently in what we're calling the market engagement phase, which is basically the phase during which we'll gather feedback and use this feedback to improve our proposals. We're running market engagement this way due to the competitive nature of the bidding process, so that everyone has access to the same information and a fair chance to bid. And this is one of 3 identical sessions providing an overview of the scheme, and we'll consider in due course whether we'll run any more sessions before we open applications. So perhaps more focused sessions, for example. And once market engagement is complete, then we go into what we're calling the application process or application phase. And this is for applications for project development funding. And we're hoping this will happen in autumn, but it'll depend on the feedback that we receive during this market engagement phase. Once the applications have closed, the bids will be assessed against set criteria, which I'll cover later today in the presentation. And then the projects that are successful in their application would enter into the project development phase, which we're currently hoping will commence in early 2022. During the project development phase, which I'll cover in more detail later, we'll provide grant funding to projects and then work with them to develop their plans. And it's likely that projects will need to pass through a series of milestones or gateways, culminating in a decision on the award of a long-term funding agreement. And once the projects pass the final assessment, then the long-term funding agreement will start, and then activities on the ground can start taking place. Next slide, please, Shaz. So in terms of eligibility, we're currently proposing that projects should be a contiguous block of land between 500 and 5,000 hectares, and that all land types will be eligible. So this includes land inside or outside of protected areas and common land as well. And the land itself could be provided by any landowner or land manager, for example, individual farmers, landowners or organizations, or groups of different land managers. And we're currently proposing that public bodies will also be eligible, but only if they apply in collaboration with other landowners, so not on their own. Next slide, please. So in terms of other schemes and whether you'll be eligible if you're involved with other schemes, we're currently proposing that land managers would still be eligible for landscape recovery if they're in other schemes such as the ones listed here. But a key principle for us is that projects wouldn't be able to claim funding for activities that they're already being paid for or that they're otherwise required to undertake. So our current thinking is that it would be best for both the projects and for us if we help them to transfer out of any existing DEFRA agreements and into landscape recovery, if possible. And this would avoid having different layers of agreements with different end dates, different terms and conditions, etc., on the same site. And we discuss with each individual project as part of the project development phase how we do this, and we'd look to put in place suitable agreements as part of arrangements, as part of the long-term agreement. And we'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. It's also important to stress that we wouldn't expect farmers or land managers to include their whole holdings in a landscape recovery agreement. So the site of 500 to 5,000 hectares could include parts of their holding or their entire holding if they choose to. And then the land managers could, if they hadn't put the whole holding in, they could enter into other agreements on other parts. So for example, sustainable farming incentive. Next slide, please, Shaz. So one big challenge with these large-scale, long-term projects will be ensuring that they're safeguarded for the long run, especially given the investment in both money and time that will be needed to get them off the ground. And it's therefore really important to ensure that project partners are committed to delivering a shared and long-term vision. And for this reason, we're expecting that formal governance arrangements would be required for the projects that involve groups of land managers. And from DEFRA's point of view, we'd like to aim to have a single agreement, as I said earlier, rather than with the project, rather than several separate agreements with different project partners. One option to do this would be setting up an overarching structure, such as a trust or a community interest company. But again, we'd be, as with everything in this presentation, we'd be open to your ideas on how this could work. And our project development funding as well could also help support groups to put in place suitable arrangements if they don't already have them. Given that these will be long-term projects, we expect that tenants and landowners will need to work together as part of developing bids, and we'll probably ask questions on this in our applications. Next slide, please, Shaz. So how will the applications work? So as I mentioned previously, we're hoping to open applications for the first wave of pilots in the autumn. we're currently proposing that the window for applications could be 6 weeks long, and that we'll publish guidance on how to apply a week prior to opening the applications. And there'll be a separate application for each of the 2 themes that Sophia covered earlier, and the applications will be assessed against set criteria, which I'll cover in a moment. And the highest scoring projects will then progress to the project development phase. We're aiming to take around 15,000 hectares worth of projects into project development in the first wave, with a roughly even split across the 2 themes. So the exact number of projects would depend on the size of the chosen projects. So we could take, for example, 15 projects of 1,000 hectares each, or about 7 of around 2,000 hectares. Next slide, please, Shaz. So moving on to the criteria, and over the following 2 slides, we've set out a summary of the criteria that we're proposing to use in our assessments of the applications. And projects that score highly against all of these criteria would stand a good chance of being selected, but as the selection process is competitive, it will also depend on the quality of other bids that have come through. We'll provide much more detail and guidance on the format of the application and how the criteria will be assessed and weighted in due course when we open the applications. But for now, I'll just give you a quick overview, and please do post any questions that you have on the Slido, and we can cover them at the end. So the first criterion will vary between the 2 themes. So for the first theme, projects will be expected to outline potential contributions to the recovery of England's threatened native species, so notably birds and insects, which will be used as a proxy. And then for bids under the second theme, the first criterion would expect projects to describe how they'll restore streams and rivers, for example, by improving hydrology, aquatic ecology, or hydromorphology. And this first criterion will likely carry the highest weighting, although we're still working on the weightings themselves, so that's not definite at this stage. The second criterion requires projects to outline the contribution they could make to net zero, and we expect this to be the second most highly weighted criterion on the project's benefits. The rest are in no particular order. Criterion 3 would assess environmental co-benefits, which Sophia mentioned earlier, and these are the ones that are not already captured through the primary theme or through the net zero criterion. So, for example, clean air. Criteria 4 and 5 will assess how suitable the project would be in the local environmental context, and also whether it will likely to be resilient to climate change. And then criterion 6 would consider the social impacts of the project. So, for example, how it will benefit local communities and promote access to and engagement with the countryside, for example, via education or recreation. And for all of the outcome-focused criteria that are on this slide, the projects will score more highly the greater the impact they plan to make from their current baseline. A site that's not currently in a good state and plans to make great improvements is likely to score higher than one that's already in good condition. But we are also considering how best to support sites that are already in a favourable position through our environmental land management schemes, and we'll share further thinking on this in due course. Next slide, please, Shaz. So just to cover off the rest of the criteria, the 7th criteria would expect projects to outline the long-term vision. So this includes the proposed agreement length, governance structures and safeguards, such as designation as a national nature reserve or the use of a conservation covenant. And we'll support projects to develop these plans during the project development phase. But it's important that we identify at the outset that those projects which are committed to long-term land use change and have already begun to think about how this could be achieved. The 8th criterion will assess the project's impact on food production. This is in line with the Food Duty and the Agriculture Act, and all else being equal, our preference would be for projects which have a lower impact on food production. So, for example, by taking less productive land out of production. The ninth criterion we have focuses on how projects will engage with different stakeholders, which is key to the longevity and success of large-scale long-term projects based on the evidence we have. And we'll also be looking for evidence that the projects demonstrate collaborative working, for example, if they're being delivered by a group of land managers, partnership working as well, for example, with sector experts, NGOs or academics. And we also want to understand what steps the projects have taken or plan to take to engage with the local community and account for their views. Criterion 10, this requires projects to outline how the project will assess its impacts and performance and how learning will be shared with others and how it will be applied. And then finally, the 11th criterion we have is to assess value for money for the project development grant by requiring projects to estimate the funding they'd need for this phase. And across all these criteria, we'll be looking to strike a balance between asking for enough information to make an assessment versus putting too much onus on projects to develop detailed proposals without the benefit of the project development funding and support. So wherever possible, we'll keep the application process light touch, and then we'll look to work with projects on the detail during the project development phase. We've also not ruled out the possibility of adding additional criteria here, and we want to avoid having, if for example, we want to avoid having too many applications, if we have a lot of interest, as this could lead to a lot of people's time being wasted, then we may want to sort of strengthen and focus some of the criteria to make it more difficult to score highly. And another thing we could do is add a criterion relating to the innovative delivery or blended finance models, so that we can prioritize projects that are most likely to help us test these new approaches, and then they could be adopted by others as the scheme expands and scales up in 2024. As I said, we'll confirm the final criteria when it comes to opening the applications, but this is just to give you an idea of what we're thinking for now. Next slide, please, Shaz. So in terms of what happens to you once you've submitted your application, once they've been assessed against the criteria, there's going to be two possible outcomes. Successful projects, as I said, will move into the project development phase, and unsuccessful applicants will be provided with feedback on the reasons that their application was unsuccessful. And then we'd also signpost them to other schemes which may be relevant for them. So, for example, countryside stewardship, local nature recovery, etc., or even potentially future rounds of landscape recovery. Next slide, please, Shaz. So now I'm going to cover a bit on the project development phase. Next slide, please. Our current thinking on this phase is that if projects are successful in their application, they would need to complete certain activities such as the ones shown on this slide. And we're still developing these, but we're thinking currently that progress would be assessed at intervals, as I mentioned earlier, or gateways, as we're going to refer to them as, so that we can check that they're on track for successful completion of the project development phase. And as I said, we're in the process of designing exactly what we'll be looking for at each gateway, but we also want to ensure that the process is flexible and can accommodate projects progressing at different speeds. So our expectation is that some projects could complete this phase as quickly as within 6 or 7 months, whereas others may need up to 18 months. It's important to say that our aim is that as many projects as possible progress to long-term funding agreements. So all of those that get into the project development phase, we would like to go into a long-term agreement, but there may be circumstances in which either one or both parties decide that it's not, parties being us and the project, sorry, decide that it's not, that landscape recovery just isn't appropriate for them, and at that point they may drop out or go into another scheme or be directed to another scheme. Next slide, please, Shaz. So funding and support during the project development phase. The specific amount of funding awarded to each project we think will be based on need and evidence of eligible expenditure. So for example, a project might need less funding if it's already prepared some of the deliverables through participating in tests and trials, or the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. Maximum spend for the project development phase could be set at £500,000 per project, but this is subject to final approvals internally and with the Treasury. And we're considering whether DEFRA would provide any advisory support, or whether we would expect projects to procure their own advisors. And the position might vary between different forms of advice. So, for example, regarding land management planning, monitoring and evaluation, or business planning. And we want to be able to share the learning between projects during this phase, so ensure that all of the projects that have got through to this phase are learning from each other as they go. Next slide, please. Okay, so over the next few slides, we're going to show some example projects. These are all fictional and purely illustrative to give you an idea of what could be a competitive project. So forgive some of the names that we've made up here. So here we've got Wild Peakdale, which is a 3,500 hectare upland site with mixed soil types. And a group of landowners, tenants and commoners want to return a degraded upland site to a more extensive land management system that will bring back a mosaic of more wooded landscapes to benefit priority species that are both national and local priorities. And then they want to put it under a long-term covenant. So they're going to create 1,500 hectares of woodland through a combination of native tree planting and natural regeneration, only on the appropriate soils. And then on the peatland, they're going to regenerate and re-wet it by blocking gullies, for example, planting appropriate moorland species and controlling bracken. And then they're going to use extensive grazing in some areas to create a dynamic mosaic of habitats which are known to benefit a variety of priority species. And then on the social side, they're going to repair eroded footpaths and also create 2 new footpaths and information boards in appropriate areas, but avoiding ecologically sensitive parts of the project. Next slide, please, Shaz. So we think this could be, depending on other applications, of course, this could be a competitive bid for the species recovery theme. So they've got biodiversity benefits. They've looked into the priority species in the area and how they can benefit them. They've got carbon sequestration in terms of the peat and the trees, improvements to water quality from the peat and the trees again, and then also improved public access and safeguarding with the covenant. It's also collaborative. It's suitable for the local natural environment. So they've got native trees, considered the local priority species, and it's on less productive land, so it would score well against those criteria too. And then let's also say that if they had a clear stakeholder engagement and governance plans and well-costed requirements for the project development phase, so they scored highly on those fronts as well, for example, it could well be a competitive bid. Next slide, please, Shaz. So looking to a lowland site, we've got the Living Floodplain, which is a 1,500 hectare lowland site. And here a group of farmers want to remeander rivers and streams to reconnect the rivers with the floodplains of the surrounding land, to improve the quality of the river habitat for aquatic species and to make space for water at times of high flows. So they want to remove several redundant water level control structures which are known to be preventing fish passage up and down the stream and replace them with riffle and pool sequences. They want to plant areas of new woodland in appropriate areas of the sites to buffer the water courses from agricultural activity and to slow the flow of floodwater runoff and reduce downstream flood risk. And they've also looked at historic evidence of what the area would have been like, and they want to restore some semi-natural habitats, including a floodplain grazing marsh and a wetland, to encourage the return of priority species associated with these habitats. On the social side, they want to deliver a program of citizen science and educational activities in partnership with the local university, which will enable the community and diverse groups to engage with and benefit from the project. Next slide, please, Shaz. So again, this could be a competitive bid, in this case for the rivers and stream recovery theme. So they've got they're improving hydrology, water quality in the river habitats. They've got carbon sequestration in there, with the tree planting, and they've also got biodiversity co-benefits from the habitats that they're creating. So the wetlands, for example, and climate resilience. So they're going to contribute to flood defense, or flood prevention rather. And again, there are other criteria that would be important here, but let's assume that they've ticked off all of those as well. Next slide, please, Shaz. So moving to a coastal example, we've got the Great Estuarine Restoration, and this is a 4,500 hectare estuarine site. Here we've got a large landowner working in partnership with an environmental NGO and a farmer cluster to create a national nature reserve, which will connect two SSSIs, and they've considered forecasted sea level rises in the area, and they plan to connect fragmented intertidal habitats such as salt marsh, mudflats, and coastal lagoons, as I said, including two SSSIs, and where appropriate, they'll also re-wet grassland and arable land to create freshwater and saline habitats. And all of these actions will benefit priority bird species, which they've identified, as well as increasing the surrounding area's resilience to flooding, sequestering carbon, and improving water quality. And then on the social side, they plan to work in partnership with local councils and businesses to deliver an awareness raising campaign to the public and to businesses to promote the coastal fringe as a valuable habitat and as an ecosystem that's worth visiting and investing in. Next slide, please, Shaz. So again, this could be a competitive species bid. They've looked at what the priority species are in the area and nationally, and they've improved the habitat for those species, and they've also got plenty of co-benefits to go alongside that, including those relating to water. But in this case, those would be a co-benefit rather than the primary focus. Next slide, please, Shaz. So just to look at an example of what might not be such a good bid. So this is a large-scale project of regenerative arable farming, sorry. So the farmers plan to deliver coordinated land management measures to benefit farmland birds and pollinating insects, and to reduce runoff into watercourses. So the proposed land management will include things like hedgerow management, pollen nectar mixes, and bird seed mixes for the winter, flower-rich field margins, etc. And all of these will have really good impacts, and they would be deployed to fit in and around more intensive arable farming operations and cereal cropping across the farms taking part. So next slide, please, Shaz. As I said, this would be a great project, and it's definitely something we'd want to support within the environmental land management schemes, but it would probably be better delivered through a combination of SFI and LNR, Sustainable Farming Incentive and Local Nature Recovery schemes, rather than through a bespoke landscape recovery agreement. Next slide, please, Shaz. Final one from me, and then I'll hand back to Sophia and stop rambling. Okay, so grazing. We're aware that many of you will be interested in how grazing fits into landscape recovery. And the headline is that the grazing will be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And this is because in some situations, it'll be a really useful tool to meet the desired environmental outcomes. but the impacts of grazing depend greatly on the soil type and other local environmental factors, as well as stocking density. So, for example, on peaty soils, it can release a lot of carbon. And we'd encourage applicants to consider this when they're drawing up their applications. And for example, in some cases, it might be appropriate to graze certain parts of the project, but not others. And now I'll hand back to Sophia, who's going to talk about payments.
Thanks very much, Sam. Not rambling at all. So we're on to the last part of the presentation before we move on to Q&A, where we're going to focus on payments. And I've seen lots of questions on this in the Slido. So can we go to the next slide, please, Shaz? So our current thinking is that payments for the long-term agreements would be bespoke to each project and would be something we'd negotiate during project development. And that includes potentially the payment approach as well as the specific rates for the different elements. Before I talk about this, it's really important to say we haven't yet developed detailed guidance on this area. It's a current priority for the team, so that you'll probably be, there'll be other details that we'll be able to share in due course. But a key reason for talking to you all at this point in time is we really want to take on board your ideas for ways we could innovate in this space. And as part of the feedback form, you'll see that we've got some questions around, for example, particular models you might be interested in doing, because we don't want to inadvertently rule out anything if actually there's some great ideas out there that we should be trying to accommodate. So we've set out some high-level considerations over the next few slides, but would be really interested to hear your proposals and ideas. And we will be providing more detail in due course when we've had a chance to consider those. On this slide, we have set out some of the factors that are important to government and which will play into negotiations on the payment approaches and payment rates from our point of view. So first and foremost, we want payments to secure good value for money for the taxpayer. Part of that means avoiding double funding or paying for the same activity twice through different schemes. We're very interested in questions around how we can enable stacking and bundling of different funds, though. So, there's different models for that, but it is important we don't pay for exactly the same thing twice. We're also very keen to help projects draw on private finance and private sources of funding, and that could be in terms of upfront investment or ongoing revenue payments, for example, through some of the credits, carbon credits or biodiversity credits and so on that are being developed, and really keen to explore models that will enable that. As part of agreeing payment rates, we need to consider the fairness between projects, and this means we'll take into consideration what payment rates we've agreed within this scheme for other projects and with other schemes, and we will need a really clear rationale for agreeing any bespoke elements or variations for a particular project. And finally, we will need to ensure our payment approach is consistent with cross-government policies, the law that applies in this area, for example, as well as our domestic and international obligations, in particular in relation to trade. As some of you will be aware, there's a particular consideration we have to give to whether any payments are trade distorting, and we're currently working through some thinking on some different approaches to ensuring that, so that we can still enable bespoke payments and some flexibility. But that's just something that is very important that we bear in mind from government's perspective. Can we please go to the next slide? Thank you. So again, very broadly speaking about some different things we could be including in the long-term agreements, we are open to paying for upfront capital investment, as well as ongoing maintenance or the outcomes being delivered in over the lifetime of the agreement. We're considering as part of that whether we could help fund land acquisition, and if so, whether any conditions would apply to that. For example, that could be subject to match funding requirements, or we might stipulate there'd have to be a strong safeguard on any land bought, for example, through a conservation covenant. We'll need to set payment rates consistently with the principles we set out on the previous slide in our payment principles document, which we published in June. Illustrative options include whether we could do a bespoke income for plus cost-based payment, which is one methodology that's compliant with our trade obligations. But also we're looking at the options for developing and agreeing a framework for outcome-based payments. And again, I've seen in the Slido a few questions about this, because that could help us align with environmental credit markets and help land managers leverage funding from those markets as they develop over time. But we're really, really interested in your proposals in terms of payment approaches and what innovative ideas you have. And as I said, we will feed that into our thinking over the next few weeks. Could we go to the next slide, please? So on this slide, we're just saying a little bit more about blended funding models. There are lots of models being tested and developed through tests and trials, through the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, through the initiative of lots of external organisations, and we're really excited to see how we could deliver some of those to this scheme. Definitely, enabling projects to attract and leverage private investment is going to be really important for this scheme to help ensure the agreements represent good value for money over their lifetime. And there's various different models that could be used. We've just sketched some of them out on this slide. It could be an area-based model where we pay for delivery on some parts of the site and others pay for delivery on other parts of the site. Or match funding is another sort of well-established model where we could pay for a percentage of certain costs and the remaining funds would need to be raised from other sources. The other models in this slide start thinking about some of the things we've seen being tested recently. For example, in models where there's an intermediary who could be owning the outcomes of a project, paying land managers to undertake interventions, which they deliver the outcomes, for example, for water or carbon or biodiversity, and then they would own the outcomes and could unbundle them to sell them to different investors, for example, as credits. Would be interested in exploring whether there's particular projects which are looking at that kind of a model. Alternatively, DEFRA could be a first investor with private money coming in after, or we could be a final investor providing capital once a predetermined amount of private money has been committed. There's this area, obviously, there's lots of different more detailed models being developed, and I think we think the most suitable model is likely to be dependent on the individual circumstances of the project members and the investors. So we don't think we'll necessarily be focusing on one particular model, but we want to support the projects in the project development phase to consider the options available to them. But in the meantime, please do let us know in the feedback form if you've got any particular blended finance models in mind, so we can consider how they can be accommodated within the scheme. We've got one last slide now before we move on to the Q&A. We just want to say a few final words on governance, which is an area where this is a bit different to how the other schemes work. Again, I've seen some questions about the difference between LNR and LR. So we think that the project should be governed so that those involved delivering the project are sufficiently represented for the project's lifetime. We want to be able to have a single agreement with the project. That's our preference at this point. And we want the project decisions to be fair, open and transparent, especially regarding how the funding is being used. So there's different ways those objectives could be met, and we think that the specific governance arrangements could be different from project to project and designed based on the particular parties involved. We would be open to intermediaries or market facilitators playing a role in negotiating or managing projects on behalf of groups of land managers. For example, that could be local trusts or registered charities or cooperatives or credible organisations who could be involved in that. Projects could look to set up an entity to govern the project, and I think, as Sam mentioned earlier, models involving trusts or community interest companies could be suitable. It'd be great to get your feedback on this, and again, we'll be looking to work with projects to put in place something that suits the project's needs, while ensuring there's suitable governance for the lifetime of the long-term agreement. I think we've got one more slide on next steps now, and then we're going to go on to Q&A. So after the meeting, we're going to share a feedback form with everybody. It's a mixture of multiple choice survey questions, so hopefully quicker, and then also some free text boxes with specific questions. I hope it won't take too long for you to complete it, but basically the more feedback you provide, the more helpful for us in terms of helping us finalise the scheme design. So thank you in advance for helping with that. For example, on the form towards the end, there's a box where you can provide more information about any bids you're thinking of making for landscape recovery. So please do fill this in. It will help us hear more about your ideas, and in particular, anything novel or innovative about your project that you think we should be catering for. And that will help us as we firm up our more detailed guidance, not to inadvertently rule something out that actually would have been a great thing to test. After these 3 initial sessions, we'll be poring over all of that feedback and taking on board all your ideas and suggestions. We are open to holding more workshops in the autumn. We could run repeats of these sessions. I think some people have been asking about whether we'll be recording the sessions, and the answer is yes, we are recording right now and we'll share the recordings. But we may run more sessions with this content if we think there's a need to do that, or we may run further workshops that are focused on particular topics if we think we need more input on those specific topics. You're welcome to suggest anything on the feedback form that you'd like to hear more about, and we'll be in touch in due course to confirm if we are running any further sessions. And then, safe to say, when we come to open applications, we will make sure there's plenty of information and opportunities to understand more about those and how you can go ahead and bid if that's what you want to do. Okay, so there's just a few questions that we had on the next slide. Just to give you a flavour of some of the things we're thinking about at the moment. In particular, we've talked about innovative models. Overall, we want to gauge if there's interest in delivering the kind of projects we're seeking. Are there projects out there that want to do this? And whether the scheme design we've proposed, from the applications through the project development phase, and so on, would meet projects' needs. So I think we're about to move on to the Q&A. But obviously, because we're still developing this scheme, some of your questions are very good questions and we don't know the answer yet. And the kinds of questions that are coming up are really helping us think through where we need to, where there might be things we might need to reflect on or need to provide more detail. So yeah, looking forward to getting to the Q&A, and I think I'm handing back to Catherine now.
Yes, you are. So we can now take the slides off and you get to see our faces again. So I'll ask the panel to put their videos on, apologies, and we'll start going to some Q&A. So lots of people have been coming through on the Slido. We've got over 100 questions, so I suspect I'm not going to get through them all, but I've tried to capture some of the themes, and the top questions have been bouncing back and forth, but thank you so much. So the first question that's kind of stayed at the top the whole way has been about from Chris Harrop about a group of farmers that want to form a cluster to do a landscape project. And they are asking, how can they get access to facilitation? So James, I'm going to come to you on that one.
Thanks, Catherine. Yes, good question. So I think the first part of this is to look at what's available now. There is the Countryside Stewardship Facilitation Fund, which could be a means to get you off the ground as a group. And of course, you can look at potential of existing countryside stewardship in the interim. Those, CS will be available for applications through till 2023. Secondly, yes, I mean, we are looking at the long-term future of where that fund evolves into. We think it's going to probably be something that has a broader reach than it has under countryside stewardship. Yeah, that's an area of development still for us. It's likely that we will want to provide funding for groups to come together and to support things like landscape recovery, but other things across the programme.
Brilliant. And I think I want to be clear about that's the kind of future ambition for landscape recovery, but obviously you've got a pilot phase now. How will that work during the pilot phase?
So there's a very strong potential linkage here with the new local nature recovery strategies that are being developed. Mm-hmm. So we see facilitation as a key route by which groups who come together under the auspices of the local nature recovery strategies will identify their priorities and then through facilitators provide that message to land managers on the ground about what's environmentally most important in that area. And that could be really useful information in terms of landscape recovery as much as it is for local nature recovery.
Brilliant, thank you, James. And
Catherine.
then, oh, sorry, Sophia, come in.
Hello. Can I just come in on landscape recovery? For our pilot projects, as Sam referenced, we want to strike a balance between how we set our criteria to make sure we don't end up being flooded and inundated with applications that we can only take a handful forwards at this stage. So we don't, we're reflecting on how we focus the criteria to avoid that risk. So I think at this stage, the aim is that we try and keep the applications as sort of simple as possible for the people who'd be eligible to apply, and not make it too onerous to put the initial application in, and then we'll use the project development phase to help people put in place all the detail ready for delivery. But that said, if it was a group at an early stage of of thinking about how they could work together, probably some of those other schemes and other routes might be more viable at this stage, and then potentially building to look at landscape recovery at a future date. So it's a bit of a sort of, I suppose, a longer term journey then. But if you do think you've got a group who meets our criteria, can deliver what we're looking for, then it'd be great to see an application from you, and we hope we'll keep it sort of simple at the first stage so it doesn't take too much paperwork.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and good clarity about how that works for landscape recovery. I'm going to come on to contiguous. So I'm going to ask first, what does contiguous mean? I always think I know, but Sam, explain what contiguous means, and then we've got lots of questions about it.
Yep, no problem. So contiguous, we're just meaning a connected block. So the entire 500 to 5,000 hectare block has to be connected at some point, rather than having patches.
Yeah, so we've got a question slightly further down the way about a collaborative group. So they would all have to share boundaries to participate. Is that right?
Not necessarily all of them having to share boundaries at the same point, but yeah, they would need to be connected in some way. So it could be, say if there were 3 landowners, one connects to one in the middle who connects to both either side, but each end doesn't connect to each other, kind of thing.
No, that's a really helpful example. And the big top question here is that rivers and streams, which is one of the key themes that we have in landscape recovery, doesn't lend itself very well to 500 to 5,000 hectares of contiguous block. How are we going to address that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think our current preference is for these contiguous blocks because we think that this will ensure that the sites have a strong sense of place, and also because for the species theme, at least, certain species benefit from large expanses of connected habitat. I think we'd be interested to hear your feedback on your sort of reasoning behind why it wouldn't it would be difficult to do in that sort of landscape or in certain areas of the country, and then we can consider whether there are any situations where we could where non-contiguous blocks could be suitable.
That's really helpful, Sam, because actually a question that came through was about particularly like the lowland and southeast. So we don't know if is that on your radar already as being a particular area that might struggle with this?
Yeah, I think it is definitely. We know that the land ownership in that area is complex, so we're aware that there could be difficulties in certain parts of the country. But as I said, it'd be good if people could. I think there should be a spot in the feedback form where you can just type in other things. So if you could let us know exactly why you think it would be difficult in certain areas, then we can think about how we can find solutions for that.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And this kind of, oh, sorry, Sophia, come in.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say it'd be particularly good to hear specific examples of projects which you think could deliver what we're looking for, but aren't technically contiguous. Because ultimately at this stage we're looking at taking forward a relatively small number of projects. So it's sort of where we draw the line for this first round, basically. So please do share those examples.
Which is really helpful because we have the other next question is about it's not really realistic for small landowners, and there's a couple of questions on the back of that I want to come to. So there is a question about the flexibility of that, and I think, Sam, your point about a sense of place is quite a helpful parameter there. So I think that if you have got an example of small landowners and that you could talk to us about, I think that would be really valuable. Does anybody of you want to come back to that on the small landowners part?
I think one thing I'd just say we have already reduced the range. We did originally have 2,000 to 3,000 hectares at one point, which we subsequently realised was potentially a bit ridiculous for small landowners and could prohibit them from applying. So we have reduced it to 500 hectares for that reason. But yeah, I mean, feedback on and ideas on what else we could do or what else we could consider while still delivering the same outcomes that we're after would be really valuable, I think. I don't know if Sophia or if any others have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, we also recognise that there's all kinds of incredibly valuable things that can happen at all kinds of scales, and that's why we have. This is one of the 3 new environmental land management schemes. So it might be that there's brilliant projects that are a bit smaller, don't qualify for landscape recovery, but hopefully would absolutely qualify for the other schemes. So this is just one of that set of schemes. I think, you know, at this stage, this is our first round of pilot projects. Once we've settled the criteria for this round and proceeded with the pilot, we can then reflect on that for future rounds. And once we've run this scheme a few times, we'll get a better sense of where it's delivering best value for money, and could we deliver this on slightly smaller scale sites even than what we're currently proposing. So we haven't ruled anything out for the future of landscape recovery, and you know, we're reflecting on exactly what the criteria should be for this round. But we've set the ambition high in terms of the overall scale of the projects, partly because if we and the land managers are investing this time and money to put in place a long-term agreement, we think that it'll be most valuable to do that when we're delivering really big impacts by looking at larger scale projects.
And just on the back of that, there's been quite a few questions about the upper limit. So you've talked a bit, Sam, about the lower limit and how you've reduced that. But on the upper limit side, what if people are above it? So we had a really good example of someone that's only 400 hectares above the limit. Is there any flexibility? But others that are quite far above your limit, what's the openness to that?
I think the answer is if you share us your examples in the feedback form, then we can reflect on whether we can you know, amend the upper limit, remove an upper limit, have some additional flexibility. It will really help us understand where the appetite is, because until today we haven't had much chance to hear from you about your projects and you know, what ideas are out there that we could be looking to support. So tell us what you're thinking of in the feedback form, and we'll have a think.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm just going to quickly go on to think about landowners and who this is targeting, and then I'm going to come back to the questions. I'm trying to capture all the questions as we're going. So just a quick one about a bit of a concern that's coming through on a few questions about this deterring normal land owners or farmers or land managers. Kind of what's the role for farmers in this, and actually the way that it's being developed, being built better for kind of ENGOs and large estates, because it involves so much management and control, and actually that's going to be really difficult for some farmers. So what's your response to that? And I'll come to you first, Sophia.
Thank you. So for these first projects, you know, we're looking at projects that probably will largely involve land use change to support species and support water-based outcomes. We would like to be able to work with a variety of different land managers to deliver that, and we're thinking quite hard about how we could support different types of land managers in the scheme, and that's exactly why we've put in place this project development phase, so that we can provide advisory support and funding to help people get their proposal, you know, fully developed before we make a decision on whether we're happy to go ahead. You know, there are lots of other things that are important when you're looking across landscapes and, you know, multifunctional landscapes, farming and so on, and that's why we have other schemes that are focusing on those things. So you know, the question at this moment, I suppose, is if it's a group or any combination of land managers who think they can deliver what we're after, then we want to make sure the scheme can work for them. And if you can see any sort of barriers to people being able to apply or be successful in the scheme, then let us know, because we've been thinking very hard and want to make sure it works for different types of land managers, whether it's an individual, an NGO or a charity, a group of different land managers, lots of different combinations. So yeah, any thoughts on particular barriers would be great.
Brilliant. Anybody else want to come in from the panel before I go on to our next questions? No? Good. There's so much to get through. So I love this next question. It's so frank. Other than scale, what is the fundamental difference between LR and LNR? And lots of people have voted it, so I think it's clearly not that clear. I'm going to come to James first, because I know that you're working on local nature recovery, but maybe you could set out what you think the fundamental differences are.
Well, I think there's a fair number. One of the major ones from my perspective is that with SFI and LNR, we take that slightly more traditional approach of predetermining what it is we're going to pay for and how people should do it. So to some extent that de-risks the situation for the land manager, because we're providing you with what we want you to do, and we provide you with advice and in some cases guidance on how to do that. With LR, we're throwing it open a lot more to say, you know, here's a type of an outcome that we're after. You tell us how best to do it, and we'll negotiate the price as well. So yeah, I think that's a first really big difference. There is that greater emphasis on collaboration as well. I mean, yes, local nature recovery will ask people to work together, but fundamentally you still end up with individual agreements, where I think this is a much more holistically collaborative way of doing things, and innovative in that respect. I think I'll hand over to Sophia perhaps for further ones.
Thanks, James. I think you've pretty much said everything I was going to say. I mean, we think through this scheme we'll be delivering larger scale, longer term projects and agreements, and I think that was referenced in the question. I'd just add to James's point, I think that point around how groups would work together is quite fundamental. So in local nature recovery, people could be collaborating and discussing a shared vision, but would still be able to have separate agreements and their own sort of relationship with DEFRA. But through this scheme, we want to be delivering projects that the whole project, is protected and delivered for the long run, is safeguarded, and that's why we think we need slightly stronger governance arrangements around it than we would do through LNR, and more formal governance arrangements. And as we said, that could be putting in place a structure like a trust or a community interest company, or there being a sort of entity that an intermediary that helps govern the project and manage the project. But we're really open to ideas about how that could work. But we think that's probably quite important to sort of have that strong long-term commitment for the project as a whole.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. And I've just got a couple of questions off the back of this that I've seen coming through about, I think there's a bit of confusion, and I'm confused as well, about whether you can be delivering SFI on that land, you can be doing LNR on that land. Can that also enter into a landscape recovery? Are they completely separate bits of land? Can they all be part? How do we stack this all together?
I can have a go at that. I think so. Our current thinking is that that landscape on the landscape recovery site itself, so the land that's involved in the project, there would just be the landscape recovery. In an ideal situation, there would just be the landscape recovery agreement and no other agreements. In an ideal situation, obviously there'll be bespoke agreements. So if there's an agreement that's already on there that the project member decides they want to continue until it runs out in, say, a few years, we can work around that sort of thing. But we're currently thinking that, yeah, it's unlikely that they would need SFI, LNR, and the landscape recovery agreement all on the same plot. But the same landowner might have only just put, say, I don't know, 100 hectares into the landscape recovery agreement, and the rest of his holding he might put into SFI and LNR or any other agri-environment schemes or woodland schemes, for example. So that's our current thinking. It may be that there are certain exceptions that come out as the other schemes are developed, but we'll keep an eye on that, I think.
Brilliant.
Can I just
Anybody
add
else
one?
want to come in?
Yeah,
please,
just to add one point to that. I think that's our vision for LNR and other DEFRA agreements, because we are assuming that the project doesn't want to have lots of different agreements with DEFRA with lots of different end dates, regimes, and so on. When it comes to agreements with private providers, obviously there might be other agreements sort of supporting the overall landscape recovery project. So you could have an agreement with a water company and then an agreement with DEFRA for landscape recovery. So in those situations, you might have more than one agreement. But yeah, our assumption is that would be better. But if you tell us that you think you would rather be able to have lots of different DEFRA agreements across a project site, then that's something we can reflect on, and hopefully through the bespoke agreements we could agree suitable arrangements anyway. But we're assuming it's simpler all around for it to all sort of move into one overarching landscape recovery agreement with DEFRA.
Brilliant. James, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, flexibility is one of the key things that the ELM schemes as a whole should represent compared to where we've been with previous schemes. So, yeah, if you were, say, doing the sustainable farming incentive pilot, we hope people will be able to end that fairly flexibly if they were to go into a better LR agreement at some point. And I think the same principles will apply to the other schemes too.
Thank you very much, James. And you can see we lost Ben for a minute there, but Ben is now back. And I did also apologise. I meant to say, for those of you that put your questions in the chat, I've been also capturing those and trying to feed them into what we're doing. And if you did have issues logging in earlier, there are other sessions we can invite you to, and there will be a recording available. So please don't feel like you've missed out on anything. So we've got a question here, which I think is more of a statement, but it feeds into lots of other themes that have been coming through about governance and application. So 6 weeks application window seems really short. It's a lot of information to get together in a very short space of time. And we had some quite specific things about some of those governance arrangements you're talking about. They can take time to set up. How is someone meant to prepare for this if there's only a 6-week application window?
Go for it, Sam.
Shouldn't have taken off mute so quickly. So I think yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, we want to keep the application as light touch as we can. So we're hoping that they won't need, everything set out in all levels of detail within the application, and that's something that we can work on in the project development phase. I think that we are on quite a tight timeline, and that we need to get this this first wave out relatively soon. And obviously, as I said, the development phase could take quite a while for those projects that aren't well developed currently. So we don't want to have a really long application window. I think in an ideal world. That said, I mean, there is potentially some flexibility on it. And again, if you can provide in the feedback forms, how long you think would be an appropriate window and why, that would be really helpful from my perspective. But I think also just to stress, it's really during the project development phase that we can support those sorts of governance arrangements if they don't already have them. So hopefully most of the things that will take ages can be pushed to that stage.
Anybody else want to come in on that one? But I think that's really helpful about that role of the project development phase is quite key here. Okay, just on the back of that governance as well, there's been a few questions that have come in separately, but they added up, they take a lot of votes about people's ability to close existing agreements if they want to then transfer into landscape recovery. That's one element. And the second element is 20 years can be a long time. Well, is a long time. What about succession planning and like moving names along, and how do we prepare for that? So I'm going to throw that at Sophia first, and then I'm going to come to whoever next thinks they can answer.
Fab, thank you. Yes, so we know that the terms and conditions of different existing schemes are varied, and some will be easier for us to, for land managers to terminate early, for example, to come into landscape recovery, and others that will be more difficult. And we envisage that at the start of a landscape recovery project, there'd be a kind of transitional period while potentially landscape recovery is running alongside some other agreements until they end, for example. And the good thing about having bespoke agreements is we think we could cater for that. But we'd like to work with land managers wherever possible to help them leave other agreements to come into landscape recovery if kind of consolidating in that way would be better for everyone, basically. So we'll be looking at on a case-by-case basis. On the point around succession, I mean, we're thinking about how we build in enough flexibility into long-term agreements to deal with sort of unexpected events, and that could involve like the land changing hands, or it could involve, potentially climate change impacting on the outcomes that have been delivered and so on. And so we'll need to make sure there are some kinds of review mechanisms or change mechanisms for the agreement to cater for that kind of thing. But that said, on the other hand, we also do want to make sure that these are long-term projects that everyone involved is really committed to. And that's why we've talked about things like safeguards. So, for example, conservation covenants that would help ensure even if the land did change hands, that the project would still stay together and not disintegrate. And so it's about striking that balance, really. And again, that's sort of part of the detail we'd negotiate in the project development phase in terms of the specific T's and C's in the long-term agreement.
Thank you. James, you're off mute. Were you hoping to come in?
Well, just on the point of existing agreements, as Sophia said, it depends on the type of agreement that you've got. And one of the main divisions is whether you've got an agreement, say, in countryside stewardship that was set up under EU rules, or one that was set up under UK specific rules, or English rules, I should say. So countryside stewardship agreements that are set up from this year onwards, and sustainable farming incentive pilot or next year sustainable farming incentive rollout agreements will be more flexible. With the ones that were set up under EU rules, it's more of a it depends, and get in touch with the RPA on that.
Thank you so much, James. Well, the next question we have is about advice. Now, the question is specifically about specialist advice in relation to historic environment, but it has come through across the board about the role of advice. And I know you guys touched on it in the presentation about something you want to look at, but we have the king of advice from ELM here, which is James LePage, which is the area that you lead. So it feels mean not to actually ask you about how the role of specialist advice you envisage working for landscape recovery.
Well, I think you can oversell my position, but yeah, so as Sophia said, the initial phase is meant to be as light touch as possible, so that shouldn't be off-putting in terms of people putting in an initial idea. The key thing is that project development phase, Someone made a good point about historic environment. Yes, if you're planning to do significant change in the way people use and manage land, we need to be really careful about protecting historic environment assets, making sure that you're aware of them, so you're aware of their potential, but also making sure you don't do something that has an unintended negative consequence. I think with historic environment, alongside other things, there's plenty of things that could go wrong if you haven't mapped things out. The key thing is understanding what it is you want to achieve and considering the implications, and it's the project development phase that is key to that. Exactly how that develops, we're going to see, but the suggestion is at the moment that we will be providing varying types of support depending on the nature of the project.
Brilliant. And I'm going to be a bit cheeky because there was some questions about how it works for other schemes. I'm just going to be a bit naughty and pose them at you. Is there going to be a cost cap to advice? Because I think there's a bit of a fear out there in the sector that it's going to be ELM could be very lucrative for advisors. But how are we going to make sure that funding gets straight through to the farmers or the land managers?
Yeah, so the schemes take a slightly different approach, don't they? Sustainable farming incentive, we are piloting and then rolling out, hopefully, an approach that the majority of people could do without needing an advisor. And there's a cultural shift for all of us here to some extent, because a lot of people take on an advisor to manage down risk. And we're taking a much more tolerant approach to compliance, much more supportive. So people should, over time, get more used to the fact that these schemes should be a little less risky. And so using advice for that purpose should be reduced. We can also reduce the need for advice by making sure our guidance is clear and our schemes are reasonably simple to explain. SFI pilots showing that that's always easier said than done, but that's the point of a pilot. We're in a piloting phase here really for all the schemes through till 2024, and there's nothing like having live agreements and putting people really on the spot to tease out where the issues are and where the challenges are.
Yeah.
When it comes to local nature recovery, we're expecting people to do things that involve a greater degree of change, greater implications for their business, greater implications for the environment, and that needs a bit more thought, and it's probably going beyond people's skills bases. But that really does depend. Farming and land management is such a broad church, so it'd be really hard for us to suggest that we want to put a cost cap on something. It's more about making sure that we've got the right people advising at the right point in the what you could call the user journey. So do people need someone to advocate or explain the overall roundness of the schemes that are available and what's right for them and who's best to do it? Do people need advice to do a land management plan? Maybe, yes. Do people need advice just to understand the application process and to submit an application? Well, hopefully not if we've got that a slicker process. And do people need advice during the life of an agreement to deliver an outcome? Again, it depends on their own skill base and the nature of the outcome they're trying to deliver. But when you get into LNR, yes, you probably need a bit more advice and support because it's more advanced in terms of the type of management, not normal farm practice, more in the vein of more sort of conservation type management. And landscape recovery, yeah, again, it comes down to the nature of the project, doesn't it? And that's one of the key things we're going to learn here, learning what the need is for support during the development phase, and then from that, understanding just what nature of support is needed to actually deliver those outcomes.
Thank you so much. I was very cheeky there, but I think it's important to know. Sophia, did you want to come in on the back of that?
Yeah, just a tiny point to just add that we're working really closely with our colleagues in the arms length bodies, and we've got some of them on the call today, listening in. So hello to all of them. But we're working really closely with them on how they can help with, providing specialist advice and also looking at the, any potential consent processes that projects might need to go through and how we can help make that as streamlined as possible. So hopefully we'll be able to deliver on that, and yeah, we'll provide more specific detail on exactly what we pay for and what advice we will provide to the projects before we open applications, and that might be tailored to this. It should be tailored to the needs of the project. So more detail to come.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to go on to the next question, which is looking at kind of how do we monitor success, which I think, Ben, might be your area of expertise, our scientist person. I've got myself caught on things. So Megan here has asked quite a specific question about, will there be baseline surveys to be conducted and funded to initially monitor success? But I think there's a wider question about how are we going to monitor the success of these projects?
So Yeah, you'll have noticed earlier in the presentation, we kind of talked about how in some cases we might want to be paying on an outcome basis and in others that might not be suitable. But essentially, regardless of whether they're being used as the payment basis, it's very important for us to be able to tell what the outcomes are, because then we can kind of learn from our progress going forwards and improve the effectiveness of the schemes. And this is particularly important for a scheme like this, which is trying some kind of fairly innovative things and trying to organize some stuff that kind of won't be the same as a bunch of things we've done before that we already well understand. And as part of that, baselining is hugely important, particularly because of the small number of total agreements compared with maybe a scheme like SFI, where there might be a much larger number of individual kind of actors doing much of the same thing. It's harder to tell whether or not things are working without having checked in first on the state of the land when you've only got a small number of plots to look at, because you can't do big statistical analysis and stuff, because maybe you've got 1 or 2 landscape recovery plots that are broadly trying to do the same sort of thing. So yes, we certainly want to, as much as possible, use information that we already have about the condition of land and how well various species are doing in an area, but also as much as we can start collecting the data as early as possible, maybe in the development phase as part of that, about how things are looking right now, and so we can start to see when we start taking measurements throughout the course of the project, are things getting better? So that will be different for the 2 different themes, and probably different for different projects in terms of the details within the same theme, even depending on exactly what they're trying to do.
Brilliant. So just to compare that to some of the other schemes, so sustainable farming incentive, you do lots of actions. So from what you're saying, you're going to be measuring the outcomes or the outputs more than the actions that people do themselves.
I would expect so, yes. It will, again, it might be a bit different for different sorts of project. For instance, it's very difficult to measure directly the effect something has had on flood risk, because you need to wait for hundreds of years and see if it floods more or less than it did in the previous 100 years, then argue a lot about whether that was actually due to climate change or what you did. So there are some things where, unfortunately, like, you do have to hew kind of closer to the action and say, yeah, well, you achieved this side change in the flow characteristics or something like that, and we expect that this improves the flood risk. But yeah, as much as possible, we want to measure as close as we can to the thing that we fundamentally are trying to achieve in the project.
It sounds like we need lots of clever scientists like yourselves to be involved in measuring, because that sounds very complicated, but really good to know that that's kind of the larger long-term ambition. Does anybody else want to come in the back of that one, or are we happy for me to move to the next question? Brilliant. So this question's been kind of up and keeps knocking down, but I've been wanting to get to it, is about landscape recovery targeted to support local nature recovery strategies and nature recovery networks. And kind of a broader question I have is about how we're making sure that landscape recovery is going to deliver local priorities. So I'm going to come to Sam first, because I think we haven't heard from Sam for a while, and then see who else wants to answer.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think with those 2 specific schemes, the LNRS and the Nature Recovery Networks, they're both quite new initiatives, and we are working closely with the relevant DEFRA teams and Natural England colleagues as well to figure out how landscape recovery can align with them and support them. For example, by being a nature recovery area, in the case of those ones. But yeah, it's still ongoing, and until we sort of see how those schemes and strategies sort of pan out, then it's difficult for us to account for them. But yeah, we're certainly going to try and make sure that we're aligned and we sort of work well with those schemes and strategies. I don't know if Sophia may have more to add on that one.
Not on that point, but on the second part of Catherine's question about local engagement, I guess Sam was saying, in the future when we have local nature recovery strategies, we can think about how to ensure the landscape recovery projects support those and align with those. In the interim, we have set out in our criteria that we want to understand how projects plan to engage with key stakeholders, including local people, and it's a really important thing to do. There's a lot of scientific evidence about how important that is for the longevity of a project, and it's something we'd look to support projects with during the project development phase, to give local people an understanding of what's happening, what's going to change, to feed in, to identify opportunities for things like citizen science, so people can really get engaged with what's happening. So that will be a key thing we're doing in these first rounds of pilot projects, and then we'll look to sort of join up more with local nature recovery strategies in due course.
Brilliant, thank you so much. We're very close to running out of time, so I'm going to squeeze in one more question, because there's so many that have come through, but it's about the role of private funded schemes. So we know that as a market it's beginning to explode. There's carbon, nitrate, biodiversity net gain, stewardship. There's so many different things. How do we all see it stacking together? And I know you sort of covered this, Sophia, in your blended finance section, but how do we actually navigate all of this?
The $1 million question. So as you're saying, as you said, the markets for these different ecosystem services are developing at the moment. A lot of them are at a fairly early stage. Some of them are more developed. That picture is changing, and that this is exactly is the $1 million question right now, as to how we bring all those different buyers of ecosystem services together to help fund projects on the ground. And that's exactly what we want to test through landscape recovery. How best can we design an agreement to do that? How do we use our funding to complement other revenue streams the projects might be able to access now? How do we design the agreement in a way that would enable projects to potentially opt out of a DEFRA funded bit of the agreement to be able to sell credits instead, if that was more lucrative in the future? We sort of I touched on it a little bit in the slides on blended finance models, but there's lots of thinking being done about this and lots of people trialing different ideas, and we want to work with people who've got brilliant ideas about how this could work, to help design agreements that could be then the prototype for how this could work in future. That feels like a cop out of an answer. We're doing a lot of work on this stuff within DEFRA, but it's a big challenge for everyone today, and this is an area where we really want to work with people to co-design different approaches. And I think this is a really exciting opportunity through landscape recovery, is to be able to do that and rethink the way we fund delivery of ecosystem services, basically.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to draw a line there because I'm afraid we have run out of time. I have tried to group questions into themes, so hopefully we've covered as much as I possibly can, but we are keeping all your questions, and I think we're building a bit of a Q&A document for ourselves that we want to share out to try and answer this. And a lot of them, like you said, because we're piloting, it may be something that we then decide we need to test. So I'm going to ask all the panel members to wave goodbye. You can turn your videos off now and relax. You're just going to see my face for a little bit. Lucky you. So thank you so much for coming to the webinar today. We are going to send up a follow-up survey. We're just going to put it together right now and get it out to all of you either today or tomorrow. And in that, as Sophia said, there's loads of questions in there where we just want to get your views and input. You can put more questions that you didn't feel were answered, but also you can give us the feedback and please do give examples of where you think this will work and not work. The session has been recorded. Some of you asked if the slides were going to be shared. We'll be sharing the recording so you can watch that back. And we have got 2 more sessions. They'll be exactly the same as this one, except the questions will obviously be different. So if you had trouble logging in today, we can sign you up for another one in the next 2 weeks, or we'll send the recording round to all of you. So I hope you found that helpful. Please do keep a lookout for that follow-up survey. It's really important to us that you complete that and get your input in so we can progress on this, but it's a really exciting time for us. So without further ado, I'm going to say goodbye just on time, and we're just going to put up a little leaving slide as we go so that you can just log off and say goodbye. But thank you so much for your time today. I hope you found it useful.